This year we are hosting a couple of months of peace focused on the theme, Healing Our Polarized Societies. This conference is co-sponsored by Johnson County Community College and the Center for Global Journalism at Park University. My name is Louis Duguid. I was a longtime journalist with the Kansas City Star, and now I'm an author, lecturer, freelance writer, and political action committee chair for the National Association for Multicultural Education. Today, I'm your moderator. First, some housekeeping. Be sure to mute yourself for the benefit of the speaker and our audience. Also, we are recording this session, so if you have concerns about that, please take the appropriate steps now, such as turning off your video. For our program, if you have any questions for our presenter, please put them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. I will share your questions with our presenter, who will leave time at the end of his program to provide answers. Our 2021 Greater Kansas City Peacebuilding Conference begins today with Michael Collins' exceptional insight on this nebulous thing called peace. Michael Collins is the executive director for the Americas at the Institute for Economics and Peace, or IEP. He develops working partnerships with Americas-based governments, civil society, organizations, foundations, universities, businesses, and think tanks. He's constantly seeking new opportunities to build the presence and impact of the Institute for Economics and Peace throughout the Americas, with a keen focus on expanding the use of the Institute's positive peace framework as a training tool and as an evidence-based metric for peace-centered development. Before joining the Institute for Economics and Peace, Michael Collins oversaw educational, job creation, and economic development programs in emerging nations recovering from natural disasters. He frequently worked with communities affected by poverty and gang violence. Before pursuing a career in the nonprofit sector, Mr. Collins studied electromechanical engineering and worked in the construction industry. So he brings a very pragmatic, workable approach and ideas to this nebulous thing called peace building. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Michael Collins.
Thank you very much, Louis, and wow, a round of applause. I certainly didn't expect that, I have to say. Allow me to go ahead very quickly and to share a slide deck that I have here, and I'm assuming that you see this. And yeah, so let me first of all, thanks for the opportunity and for your interest, right, in exploring the realm of peace building through what I hope is going to be somewhat of a slightly different perspective in some ways, so that my hope is that both you and I kind of sort of walk away having learned something new, and hopefully with some tools that are going to help us continue to expand our mutual peace building ambitions. So the first thing that I'd like to do, and I hope it doesn't get me in trouble or that I overstep the mark so early in the conference, but that is to take a sort of a slight dig, if you will, at the description heading for the conference. On the web, we talk about peace building, right? And we say, peace building refers to the activities undertaken to prevent conflict and establish sustainable peace. These activities combat the causes of violence through reconciliation, trauma healing, restorative justice, and development, while addressing social, political, and economic systems that inhibit sustainable, peaceful relationships. So my proposal, and essentially the ethos of this presentation, is to state that there's value in actually flipping this definition somewhat on its head. For example, the last part specifically can be changed from addressing social and political and economic systems that inhibit sustainable peace to strengthening social, political, and economic elements that foment peace. Now, this is kind of sort of a really small difference, but it actually fundamentally changes the question. It changes the question from what is it that stops violence to the question of what builds peace. Now, the study of conflict is something that's really important and it's critical, but we firmly believe that it really doesn't necessarily give us a complete picture or a complete window into what creates long-term peace, right? The roots of the conflict tree, the roots of the proverbial roots of conflict are not necessarily the same roots as the peace tree. And there's a couple of sort of analogies that we use to kind of sort of try and make this point, is that if you want to study what creates a long and happy life, for example, you gain limited benefit by studying ill people or studying disease, right? Similarly, for example, if you want to gain a deeper understanding of the properties of light, you can only learn so much by studying darkness. So the work of the Institute, which is a non-profit, non-partisan research institute, essentially, is to shift the world's focus to peace as a positive, tangible, and achievable measure of human well-being and progress. And we do that primarily through quantitative research and through mathematics and through statistical analysis. Now, a lot of sort of the vast majority of our work can really be summarized, if you will, in the following two questions, which is, what are the most peaceful countries on earth and what do they have in common? So the idea here is that if we have a better understanding of what are the traits of peaceful societies, then we ourselves can seek to replicate those traits in the societies in which we all live. Now, there's a couple of terms that are commonly used in the peace building field and in the field of peace studies that some of you may be familiar with, and these and have certain sort of parallelisms with these two questions. And these are the terms of negative peace and positive peace. So negative peace can be defined as the absence of violence or fear of violence. It's a superficial definition of peace, but it's relatively simple. It's generally accepted, and it's a sort of a visible way of being able to come to a quick determination or a quick measure of peacefulness, right? If people aren't killed, if there isn't violence, if there's less crime, then there are higher levels of negative peace or peace. Now, this is actually why it's called negative peace, because we're talking about the absence of something, right? In this case, the absence of violence or fear of violence. Positive peace, on the other hand, is something that is much richer. It's much more complex. It's a lot more systemic, and it refers to the attitudes and the institutions and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies, the engine, if you will, that then revs up to create higher levels of negative peace. So what I like to do is I'd like to tell you about the sort of the processes that we, the Institute, have used to sort of try and refine our understanding of positive peace at the macro level. When I mean the macro level, I mean at the global and at the national level, show some examples of how that understanding can be applied at the community level, and then present a tool that hopefully you can use to look at and to sort of evaluate and even build positive peace in your community, in your college, or even in other sort of systems as well. And one thing that I hope that we're all able to take away from this today is the deep, meaningful contributions that many of you are already making to higher levels of positive peace in the world, as well as the many opportunities that there are to build positive peace. So let's jump right in. Now, negative peace, although it's limited in the way that I described, is actually quite useful because it helps us answer that first question. What are the most peaceful countries on earth, right? And the idea here is if we know what countries they are, then we can study them in more detail to be able to find out what are these underlying traits. So this is a question that I would actually like to shoot back to the people with us today, based on the definition of negative peace, right? So the absence of violence or fear of violence. What do you think are some of the most peaceful countries on earth? So please feel free to take a stab. I suggest that we put it in the chat box, or that, if anybody wants to shout it out, that's absolutely fine as well. But it'll be great to be able to get some feedback from you guys as to what do you think are some of the, let's spend 30 seconds, 1 minute doing it. We have some answers coming in. Costa Rica, Switzerland, couple of Switzerlands, 3 Switzerlands, in fact. A lot of admiration for Switzerland, France, Sweden, Holland, Finland, so a lot of Scandinavian countries. Excellent, excellent. Norway, Sweden, Finland, Canada, Costa Rica, Iceland, New Zealand. Excellent, excellent. Well, these are wonderful suggestions, and actually, as you'll see, correlate quite strongly with our research. So keep those answers in mind. I'm going to be providing you the some of those answers, at least based on our measurements, in the next couple of minutes. What we do, or sort of our starting point for studying peace, is to a global peace index. It's a report that we produce each year, which essentially ranks countries based on this initial definition of peace, right? And what we do is we've been doing it for about 15 years. It ranks 163 countries around the world. That's nearly 100% of the world's population. And we use 23 different indicators related to this absence of violence or fear of violence. I'll give you a couple of examples in a minute. We use our own methodologies to be able to sort of compare all of these things that aren't always comparable. For example, we have 6 measures related to ongoing domestic and international conflict around the world. So the number of battle deaths in a country, the number of actual conflicts, or the intensity of those conflicts, for example. There are 10 measures of societal safety and security. So displacements, homicides, levels of violent crime, for example, incarceration rates. And then there are 7 levels of militarization, military expenditure, nuclear weapons capability, even the availability of small arms, for example. Now, when we put all of those things together and we compare them and we look at these for all of the countries, here are what we would say are some of the most peaceful countries on earth. These are in fact the top 10. And as you can see, you guys were right on the money. So, I think that largely, although we do sort of lack some quantitative evidence, we do almost intuitively have a good understanding for what is peace and how it can be created. A number of you mentioned Iceland, New Zealand, Canada also came up, and Switzerland, of course, came up as well. 8 out of the 10 of these countries are in Europe specifically. Now, if we look at the bottom end of the index, right, at the bottom end of these 163 countries, these are the countries that we would see. Some of them you'll also be familiar with, and you probably would have put in the bucket of the least peaceful countries on earth. But I just want to kind of reflect on these 2 slides for a moment, right? Because even though we call it peace studies, a lot of the time, we're, at least at a global level, we're thinking about these countries, right? These are the countries that we are studying when we're talking about gun violence, when we're talking about issues related to peacefulness in the US. It's the cities and the municipalities where there's the highest levels of conflict that we choose to study. And there's relatively little study of the countries of these sort of previous slides here, right? And we contend that by gaining a better understanding of what makes these countries tick, not necessarily these 10 specifically, but certainly the more peaceful ones, then we'll be able to develop more actionable insights for building peace. So if you go on the IEP webpage, you can actually find this interactive map that allows you to be able to go to any country on the world and click on it and actually sort of see different levels of peace over time, because the index allows us to be able to track changes in peace as well. So we can develop a whole series of insights. For example, the fact that peacefulness in the world deteriorated last year, and that it's the 9th deterioration in the last 13 years as well. Things aren't boding particularly well. More countries improved in peacefulness than deteriorated, but the deteriorations in peacefulness in countries were a lot larger. We can also sort of see, by collecting all of this data, what are the things that are driving improvements in peacefulness, and alternatively, what are the things that are deteriorating peacefulness as well. In addition to sort of the specific ranking of countries, we can also do the same for how much they're actually improving over time. And although we can look at it regionally, for example, right, in terms of the MENA region being the least peaceful region, but also improving this past year. Europe remaining the most peaceful region, and at the bottom, if you will, we can also look at the ones that are deteriorating the most. What are the regions that are deteriorating the most? Last year, just as an FYI, and I'm sure we all felt it, North America had the largest regional deterioration, largely due to deteriorations in peacefulness in the United States. Now, if we take our measure of negative peace here on the left-hand side, right, and we sort of start with this broad idea up at the top here that the perfectly peaceful state would have no jails, would have no police, would have no crime. And then we say, okay, well, we're going to measure these levels of negative peace and determine which countries are peaceful based on the fact that they have low levels of homicide, they have less violent crime, fewer military interventions, etc. And we use the Global Peace Index as a way of tracking that. Well, how do we get to analyze or find out what are the traits of the most peaceful nations? So one of the things that we do is we actually look, or we take results from the Global Peace Index and we cross-reference them using statistical analysis with thousands upon thousands of different socioeconomic data sets, indices, and attitudinal surveys to be able to see essentially what are the things on one side, right? What are the socioeconomic improvements or deteriorations or changes in health or, 1,000 different kind of sort of metrics that then lead or at least correlate with improvements in peacefulness over time. So that allows us to be able to kind of sort of develop not only an understanding of what causes it, but potentially helps us predict changes in peacefulness in the future. So let me throw it back to you guys at this point. And you guys fared very well on exercise 1. Congratulations for everybody. And exercise 2 would be based on your gut instinct and potentially the countries that you saw on our screens here. What do you think are some of the things that the most peaceful countries on earth have in common? Let's take another 30 seconds on the chat there and shoot me your best. Homogeneous, same values. Very interesting questions. We could go into a lot of detail there. Economic stability, female leadership, high standards of living, high levels of education, good legal system, no lack of ideas for sure. Economic equality, good distribution of resources, strong economy, smaller populations, very interesting note as well. Affordable healthcare, strong economy. These are all wonderful examples. I'm sure all of you are checking the chat and looking at these answers. Thank you, everybody. Rule of law, very important, of course. Resources for economy, even in times of trial. Yes, extremely relevant, of course, now in times of COVID-19. So, divestment from military population growth, they keep on coming in. Absolutely wonderful. Well, here is I suppose you could say, some of the results from the data of the Institute. And I think that you'll see a lot of parallelisms and similarities to what you're proposing here, which is in essence good news, right? It's a confirmation of the fact that we intuitively know what helps create peace. Now, when we do this exercise, and we've been doing it for also 15 years, what we see is that largely speaking, the most peaceful countries on earth have the following 8 characteristics, which we call the 8 pillars of positive peace. They have a well-functioning government that provides basic security, rule of law, and the adequate provision of basic public services. There's equitable distribution of resources with regards to education, with regards to healthcare. There's a free flow of information, not only in terms of the access the access that people have to information, but also the quality of information as well. There's a good relations with neighbors. We measure these things at the nation state level, so it would be with neighboring countries with regards to trade and immigration, perhaps. There are high levels of human capital, right? There's a well-trained, employed and productive workforce. There's an acceptance of the rights of others with regards to gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity. There are low levels of corruption or perceived low levels of corruption. And there is a sound business environment, right? Enabling the thriving of both small and large and formal and informal businesses as well. Now, countries that sort of have these characteristics or are sort of improving in these pillars, which we choose to track using the sort of 24 indicators that correlate the strongest. And we actually produce a parallel report specifically around positive peace, also have the following characteristics, right? So if a country improves in positive peace, it also has or develops higher per capita income. It also develops high levels of resilience to all forms of crisis, whether those be political crisis or natural disasters, or even crises such as COVID-19, for example. They develop better environmental outcomes. They have higher measures of well-being, and they even perform better on development goals, for example, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Now, there's kind of a few interesting things when we start to kind of sort of look through the matrix, I suppose you could say, at kind of how all of this data interacts and how all of these pillars interact with each other. One of the things that we see is that, first of all, positive peace and developing positive peace is something that's systemic. What does that mean? It means that each of these pillars is intrinsically connected with all of the others, right? They're interrelated and they are interdependent. Any change in one of these pillars is invariably going to have a change in the other pillars as well. Moreover, one of the things that we see is that the countries that improve most in peacefulness over time do so by making small improvements in all of the pillars simultaneously, as opposed to some massive improvement in a singular pillar. And I think I perhaps have shared this example before, but I equate it to kind of sort of like dragging a glass of water across a table, right? In which you have to do it slowly so as not to upset the system. And, preferably holding all around the glass, right? Taking into account all of the elements. The second thing, and this is perhaps may come as a disappointment to some, is that building peace, positive peace specifically, is a slow moving process. You can imagine trying to shift all of this to a higher state of being in a country takes time. But the good news is that it's also self-reinforcing. As and when countries have high levels of positive peace, it becomes easier and easier for them to develop high levels of peace. The bad news is that it's actually the opposite is also true. For countries that are deteriorating in positive peace, it becomes more and more difficult to be able to build positive peace, and hence the violence trap. Now, it's also contextual in the sense that a well-functioning government, for example, doesn't really mean the same thing in one place as it does in another. The understanding of the pillars varies depending on the social norms and the social context. So that's something essential that needs to be considered as well. And then last, it's linked to other systems. Now, what does this mean, and why would it potentially be important to us here? So for example, IEP, we study positive peace as you've come to standard at the nation level. But you could take many of these nations regionally, look at their positive peace value or scores, and you can make a determination of levels of positive peace in the international community. Furthermore, if a country within that community is improving in the levels of positive peace, it bleeds out, right? No systems exist in isolation. And you could also do the same analysis for something larger. Now, you can do the opposite for something smaller as well. Inside every nation, there are cities, there are municipalities, there are communities, there are organizations, there are projects, there are even families. And you can apply the principles, the systemic principles of positive peace in any one of those systems. And there is no reason you couldn't. We just happen to track it at the nation level because that's where most of the data is. But the fundamental systemic properties still apply. Furthermore, you can actually see how by building positive peace at a very local level, you can ultimately have an impact at the national level too. So let me just give you one small practical example of this to try and ground the concept a bit more. And we have nothing to do with this project. It's a wonderful project. I actually came across it online. It's actually based in Kansas City. It's an initiative that I think is ongoing in the Ivanhoe neighborhood that had suffered from underrepresentation, low income, and gun violence. And I think is kind of I understand has been very successful, and I think is very representative of a local initiative for building positive peace. Let me give you a couple of examples. For example, they've been able to establish a very strong neighborhood council, right, with people who actually grew up in the neighborhood and are very well respected. They have frequent community events and picnics and cleanups and activities, and they actually engage police in a lot of those different activities to be able to increase levels of trust. In terms of the pillar, if you will, of a sound business environment, they've taken time to create spaces and opportunities for small entrepreneurs, as well as supporting different forms of housing redevelopment. Now, in terms of free flow of information, for example, their website is incredibly informative, given the small size of the actual initiative in the neighborhood itself. And they've got extensive resources for the community, and they have monthly community meetings. With regards to high levels of capital, they focus on cradle to college education, and they have things like demonstration gardens, which not only provide sort of healthier food, but also provide entrepreneurial ideas and opportunities for people as well. Equitable distribution of resources. They have a promoting equitable neighborhoods action group. And they've started a neighborhood watch program to be able to improve security and lower levels of corruption as well. And lastly, they concentrate on the acceptance of the rights of others, because a large part of the focus is on developing racial equity. And, you know, it's not so much any one of these single initiatives, which is good, and they all are. It's actually very much the fact that they've taken upon themselves, the community this is, to be able to approach this from a systemic perspective, being able to touch on all of the pillars of positive peace without over-investing, if you will, in any single pillar, moving in that sense the system to a higher state. Now, in terms of a sort of a practical exercise, and this would be the point in which I say anybody who was required to take a screenshot, if you wanted to take that screenshot, this may be potentially the most useful slide for you. And that is that with regards to what we call the positive peace framework, these 8 pillars of positive peace that you see here on the left-hand side, you can use that as a lens through which to look at your community, look at your family, look at your classroom, look at your project or your organization, and think about how you could potentially strengthen it to be able to build positive peace. How can you turn your project into a peace building project, right? And you may immediately identify in your project or your personal ambitions or even your area of studies that you want to have an impact on a particular pillar, but take the time to think creatively and to try and kind of sort of develop connections with all of the other pillars. Those connections are there, but sometimes just by going through the process of trying to uncovering them and understanding, okay, well, I'm going to be doing this activity, or I'm thinking about this thing, and how does it relate to that, or how could it impact some other pillar, can provide a whole set of new ideas to be able to have a systemic impact, and can also make sure that you don't do any undue damage, right, as well. So you're effectively taking a do no harm approach. Many times, and I myself have been culpable of that in many of the previous development projects that I've worked on, you start something with very, very good intentions, you think it's going to work out great, the action itself is completely harmless, except that you haven't taken into account a series of chain reactions that happen further down the line. This is one of the ways of being able to do that. It really sort of helps you develop a holistic perspective of the project that you're thinking about working on, or the area of interest that you have, and developing other connections. What are the strengths that exist within the community, within the organization, within the project? Where are there potentially gaps? And in an ideal circumstance, how can my project impact all pillars, right? How can we move the glass across the table? How can we try and sort of impact all of these pillars in a very small way, but all of them simultaneously as well? Now, of course, we don't all have the resources to be able to do a project like this one that was happening in Ivanhoe. In fact, very few of us do, of course. But, you know, I mean, for example, there's, you know, you could think about an anti-bullying project, for example, in a school, right? In a playground specifically, for example, or a school environment, right? And you could apply the 8 pillars of positive peace, and you could come up with a whole set of kind of sort of ideas or considerations that you hadn't thought of before. So, for example, you know, what's considered bullying in some cultures is not necessarily considered bullying in others, right? Or people may certainly not be aware of it. Therefore, there may be a benefit of better explaining what constitutes bullying and kind of sort of making that more clear to all of the people who would potentially be responsible for it or be victims of it, for that matter. Rewards for kind behavior remind me of the pillar of sound business environment. Some bullying may be related to pure boredom, and there's opportunities to expand the number of activities, in particular activities that kind of sort of level the playing field, right, with equitable distribution of resources, high levels of human capital. So as you can see, the names of the pillars really are only a sort of a starter. You don't really need to think that, oh, you know, I have a project that I do with kids and somehow I need to affect the national government. No, that's not the question. That's not the point at all. But the point is to be able to sort of reflect on all of these different things. So looking through the lens of positive peace, so to speak, can help sort of look at these issues in new ways, focusing less on conflict and more on reinforcing the underlying attitudes, institutions, and structures that create peace. Just to end on this, and it's just because I was reading the newspaper yesterday and it came up, and I'm a big Ultimate Frisbee fanboy. if all else fails, you can organize a game of pickup frisbee. It's a no contact sport. It's like self-regulating. It's got no need for referees. Well-functioning government, right? Low levels of corruption. Respect is paramount, and it provides an opportunity for everybody to participate. It's a pickup game, acceptance of the rights of others. It rewards and develops forward thinking and strategic play, high levels of human capacity. If the teams are unequal, it is absolutely no fun whatsoever, right? Equitable distribution of resources. It foments communication and socializing, free flow of information. So as you can see, a single game of Ultimate Frisbee can also be looked at through the lens of positive peace as well. So with that, I'd really love to be able to sort of open it up to general discussion. Anybody who may think or have new ideas about how the framework could be used, or may have criticisms of the framework, for sure. Just before I end, very quickly about IEP, I'm coming at you guys from New York today. We have offices in Mexico. Any international students that may be from other countries, we may have offices in your time zone, and it could be possible that you come across our resources in other places, different forms of research that we do. We do work with a number of multilateral organizations around the world, including the World Bank and the United Nations. Our courses are included in a number of university courses around the world, and thankfully we've also have very good reception online as well. And if you want to interact more with the IEP, you can reach us in all of the usual places. For anybody who'd like to know more about Positive Peace specifically and the quantitative perspective, you can go to the Positive Peace Academy, which is this link at the top, to be able to learn much more. So with that, I'm very happy to stop sharing the screen and look forward to the discussion.
Well, I want to thank Michael for, as I said earlier, an exceptional, well-grounded discussion on peace and how do we achieve it. For all of the participants, if you would put any questions or comments you might have in the chat box, then we can go from there. I want to say, Michael, thank you for looking at the Kansas City area and singling out the Ivanhoe neighborhood. That's an area of Kansas City that has focused for a very long time on building these elements which you've labeled pillars of peace. So it's good that you grab that. I guess a question that I have that's based on Ivanhoe and so many other areas of the city that are in the process of catching up is, when you have an area that had traditionally changed from white to black during white flight, and now is changing back because of all of these unified efforts. And it's displacing a lot of Black poor residents. How do you create an environment that doesn't force this kind of displacement, but is inclusive of lower income people as well as people of different races, different ages, so that they can remain in these neighborhoods?
Well, thanks for the question, Lewis. And you know, I probably wouldn't be the best person to respond because I myself kind of sort of lack that contextual knowledge. But what I would say is that the framework can serve as a tool to be able to actually do that exercise and to be able to reflect on that specific issue, which I'm very familiar with. I live very close to Asbury Park in New Jersey, and the exact same thing has happened, right? There has been a significant investment, and this is actually, you've just given a very good example. Once again, I'm unfamiliar with that specific context beyond the Ivanhoe neighborhood. But you've given a very good example of oftentimes a significant investment in a particular area, such as a sound business environment, with the assumption that that is going to fix the issue, that is going to provide the levels of inclusion that are necessary for the whole of society to advance. And that was very much the case in Asbury Park in New Jersey, when there was a distinct focus on opening up new businesses, on the redevelopment of specific spots. And all that did was basically just move the problem from one place to another. It really had absolutely no impact, right? And that was because of the fact that not all of the different pillars were being considered as well. One of the key, so number one, there's that, and sort of the reverse of that is, as a defender of somebody who would like to ensure high levels of inclusion and opportunity, you can also use the framework in reverse, right? Because you can actually show ways in which higher levels of inclusion are more beneficial to a sound business environment as well. So you can actually make a much more stronger case to be able to enact policies that will lead to the results that you're talking about.
Okay, we've got some questions that have shown up in the chat box. Thank you, everyone. What political or government system is more likely to be useful in establishing positive peace, and how can, I guess, efforts that are toward this new system, how can that be strengthened into a more formative, positive peace?
So one of the things that we've tried to do with all of our work is, and I think I mentioned this at the very beginning, that we sort of have this tendency, at least I know I certainly do, to kind of sort of base our opinions about what constitutes the right kind of society, or what leads to peace. But a lot of that is kind of sort of based on our personal philosophies or moral values. So when it comes to the index, we try and keep the results or the analysis as quantitative and data-based as possible. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is because when you look at the Global Peace Index, what we see is that practically in all cases, more democratic countries tend to be at the top of the index, with liberal democracies being at the top. And the more authoritarian regimes are at the bottom, right? So in a nutshell, over time, and of course it depends on the year, it depends on the crisis, you will see that authoritarian regimes invariably are less peaceful, whereas democracies and specific liberal democracies tend to be more peaceful in nature. Now, there are interesting sort of caveats to that, but they're punctual, such as, for example, some of the recent shifts that we're seeing in improvements in peacefulness in authoritarian regimes versus deteriorations in peacefulness in democratic countries. In fact, some of the most peaceful countries in the world, in Europe, for example, have seen deteriorations in levels of democracy over the past year or two. But as a whole, and when you sort of look at those global trends, by far democracy comes out, if you will, from the foam as a key trait of peaceful nations.
I know that we've had the United Nations in place for decades, and that has had varying levels of success in creating a peaceful world environment. But the question that comes in is, can educating those countries with a low positive peace affect the levels of positive peace in places, say, within a time frame of maybe 5 years?
So I think that there are advancements that can be made in 5 years. I think that the term education is loaded because it presupposes that there are some values or some thoughts or some processes that can be imposed. I mean, we certainly present the positive peace framework in a manner related to traditional education, right? Here is a framework that you can use, but the important thing is for people and contexts and countries to be able to do their own analysis. What may apply over here does not apply over there. I think, Afghanistan is probably the main, one of the most glaring examples that we're trying to deal with right now. Simply the concepts and the norms are extremely, extremely different. That is why we always try and provide plenty of kind of sort of flexibility for this interpretation. I think the 5-year period is short, to be honest with you. We are looking at a 10 to 20 to be able to see any significant change in sort of actual levels of peacefulness. But let me okay. So if it's okay, let me just take a quick step back, because you can create levels of negative peace relatively easily, so to speak. You could talk about, for example, the US military intervention in Afghanistan, although that's not actually been the case because Afghanistan is and has been for 4 years now the least peaceful country on earth. But you could state the case for some form of military intervention to stop violence, right? Or gang violence, for example, or some counterterrorism measure to be able to sort of stop terrorism. But those are punctual measures and they stop levels of negative peace, but they don't contribute to creating these underlying attitudes, institutions, and structures that unfortunately take longer to create. But I mean, that's just in many ways a human condition. It's not a simple problem. It's a complex problem. It's a systemic problem. And for every step forward, there's 2 steps back. I didn't mean for that to sound depressing. I hope it didn't come across that way.
No, not at all. Here's another question. Extremist groups. We have them in this country. We saw that surface on January 6th at the US Capitol, but there are extremist groups all over the world. How can a positive peace in places and with groups such as this really turn the tide, get them to understand that the pillars of peace are workable, and that though they hold on to their ideology, that it is one that's not going to benefit everyone?
For sure. Well, I mean, I think that something that is definitely having an impact on that. I think probably in the United States, definitely in Europe as well, and probably and dare I say in other parts as well is the access to information and the quality of information that people receive as well, and the echo chambers that are forming on the internet, but also the internet being used as a tool, as a propaganda tool by many extremist groups and very well recognized terrorist groups to be able to recruit and raise money for their ambitions. We actually developed a report called the Global Terrorism Index that looks at this in a lot more detail. I'd probably go back to positive peace as a way of being able to reduce levels of extremism in practically any country. We see that it is extremism is not purely, we often tend to associate extremism with lack of immediate opportunity, lack of employment, for example. And that's not always the case. It actually changes depending on what the context of the country is. So reasons for extremism can be purely related to identity. They can be related to education. They can be related to employment. So actually invariably end up touching on all of the 8 pillars of positive peace as well.
Here's a question that I think really applies to our peace building conference. Is there anything that we as individuals can do to help with peace building?
Do you know how to play Frisbee, Lewis?
It's been a long time.
So I brought up that case not only because I thought it relevant, because I really kind of sort of wanted to reinforce the fact that although the principles or the way that we've sort of come to find this framework, if you will, was kind of sort of a national level, we do subnational positive peace analysis as well, and we've had significant success applying the positive peace framework in very simple mediation, for example, right? Being able to resolve conversations between 2 conflicting parties. I would dare to say that it's something that can also be used around the dinner table to be able to reflect on particular issues of choice and potentially address levels of polarization that we are facing, because you can have a conversation that is no longer around levels of conflict. Rather, it is around, well, what are the common points? What are the common strengths that we have that can lead us to help building positive peace as well?
Here's another that I think jumps out, enemies. People often label others as the enemy. How can that label be changed so that it creates an opportunity for a lasting peace?
Lewis, I don't know. I almost think that perhaps you and Steve would be ideally placed to answer that question based on the fabulous comments that you were making in last year's conference in relation to kind of sort of the otherism that we are facing, and specifically kind of sort of the way that the media is polarizing and kind of sort of adding to that otherism as well. Other than to sort of repeat what I just said, which is to say, you know, with the positive peace framework in many ways is sort of a common mediation technique, but it can also really serve to be able to sort of develop an understanding of how our discrimination can impact things in multiple ways. So our discrimination against another person can come back and can rebound and can affect us negatively in the future. So, you know, potentially we can use it to be able to find ways of doing the exact opposite, of showing how that inclusion, how that improved relation with my enemy will be able to build shared prosperity in the future.
Here's something that one of the persons in the audience points out that might be obstacles toward a positive peace: climate change, the coronavirus, nuclear weapons, the militarization that's taking place throughout the world. How do we get past these things and work toward something that really fits in that positive peace that you're talking about?
Yeah, it's a real challenge, and I was just reading the last sort of UN climate report that's come out, as well as the Secretary General's sort of report on what are essentially the goals of the United Nations. I mean, it's a generational challenge. The UN itself, for all of the great that it's done, is limited by the fact that it's not an actual entity. It's sort of a table, right? And it ultimately depends entirely on what each of the member states wants to do. So that is a distinct challenge. There is going to be a significant impact from climate change, and even without climate change. I mean, what we're seeing, we also have this report called the Ecological Threat Register that looks at different ecological threats and what's going to be happening over the next 30 years with regards to food security, population growth, water stress, floods, hurricanes. All of these things are exacerbated by climate change, but are also independent from it as well. And, you know, projections of significant displacement. So there's, independently of how well we're actually physically able to tackle this and mitigate it and sort of stop these damage, there are going to be countries, a high number of countries that are going to be in very, very dire straits. Now, invariably, a lot of this, we believe, comes down to being able to find ways, and this goes back to your education question, about building societal resilience within those communities, including our own, to be able to better withstand crisis in the future. And that is something doable. And you can take the COVID-19 pandemic and all of the lessons learned that we have here in the United States for how we could address this particular crisis in the future, and use the positive peace framework to be able to determine what are the elements that we need to put in place. You know, with regards to a sound business environment, well, we've done fantastically well. We have the best access to vaccines in the world. With regards to free flow of information, have we done so well? With regards to well-functioning of government, there's pros and there's cons. With regards to the acceptance of the rights of others, well, we've certainly done better than we perhaps would have, but all in all, we've done pretty terribly. We've done pretty terribly. But, you know, that's the negative side of that. But take that same framework and look at all of the things that worked out well, and then think about what are the gaps and what are the areas that we can work on to be able to build levels of positive peace in the future.
Here's another question that touches my heart. It says, my mom's a teacher in the Kansas City, Kansas school district, and the person wonders how the American education system stacks up in terms of teaching the pillars of peace to people.
So there's a wonderful initiative currently underway called Youth and Peace in Action. It's actually tomorrow is the sorry, not tomorrow, the 21st of September next week is the kickoff, and it's largely related to Rotary International, but it's going to be providing sort of complementary extracurricular peace education, which includes the positive peace framework for schools, largely on the Eastern Seaboard, but is going to be expanding throughout the United States in coming years. I'd highly recommend that you look into it. My understanding, based on my contacts and our partnership with New Gen Peace Builders, that is this organization that does peace education in the United States, is that there's, and you'll know this a lot better than I do, is that there's very little peace education studies in the United States. I have a gut feeling that there may be more in Europe. I have a gut feeling that there's probably a lot less in other parts of the world. So I definitely think that there is a distinct opportunity. We welcome any opportunity to be able to have the positive peace framework and the research included in education. In fact, that's one of my main goals. It's one of the reasons that I'm here today, I should say. And you know, just a note for the person who kindly asked the question and said that their mother was a teacher and how could this be expanded. Our director in Mexico had this experience recently. He was teaching the 8 Pillars of Positive Peace to 8-year-olds, and it was phenomenally successful. But the first thing that they said was, the name of these pillars sucks. Can we like rename the pillars? Is that okay? Yes, absolutely. Rename the pillars. Let's have the discussion. You know, what is it that you think that creates peace? What does this mean to you? And what are the things that you think that you could do, we could do, we should all be doing to be able to build positive peace in the world?
Here's another one. If Afghanistan occupies the very bottom of all of the nations when it comes to peace and the need for these pillars of peace to take hold and there to be a positive peace, what might the steps be that you would like to see in Afghanistan now that the US is out to move it from the bottom toward the top?
Wow, that's a really loaded question. And one of the reasons that I say that that is loaded is that we often try and kind of sort of stay out of politics as much as we possibly can, but also in many cases, you know, Afghanistan is a very unique situation. You know, a lot of the deterioration in peacefulness in Afghanistan is due to the fighting. So we might actually see, despite the fact that the Taliban has been classified as a horrific takeover with all of the a very rational and already being fulfilled fears about discrimination against women and girls, for example, we may find that there has actually been an improvement in peacefulness based on these metrics because of the fact that of the number of battle deaths that there have been in Afghanistan due to the conflict, and the amount of terrorism that there has been, right, in the past, in between the Taliban and the Afghan government. So a lot of people don't necessarily know this, but Afghanistan is the country that is most affected by terrorism in the world. Nearly 90% of all terrorism in the world happens in Afghanistan. And over the last years, it's been largely between the Taliban and the Afghan government. And the people who have been affected the most have obviously been civilians throughout Afghanistan. Now, with the Taliban takeover, for example, there will not necessarily be so many civilian deaths in Afghanistan. So despite the fact that this is overwhelmingly viewed as a negative advent, you would actually see potentially through the Global Peace Index in an improvement of peace, in peace. So this can kind of sort of set us a bit on the reflection, right, on what are the elements that contribute to peace in the long term, and how should our actions as a country, in this case the United States, be, or as an international community for that matter? What countries are prepared to move in the way that we would envisage them to use? What ones are ready to? Are countries ready for a democracy? Are countries, you know, or do they choose or simply want to choose to pursue another path that may not be the path that we want them to pursue, that may involve significant levels of discrimination, but at the same time, that trying to change that pattern may actually make things worse, as we have seen in this particular case. And I'm not blaming the US for the intervention by any means, but I think that it is a good example of the many, many different dynamics that come into play. When countries are at such a low level of both negative and positive peace, what we have seen through the correlations is pretty much the basic stuff, what you would already propose, what you were already presuppose, which is high levels of security, right, which is to ensure security through high levels of militarization or high levels of police on the streets, to ensure calm, a rule of law, essentially, and a strong government. So those are sort of the two pillars, although the other ones are come into play at different times, we see as being most effective at these sort of very low levels of peace. And I know that that is something that the US has tried to recreate over the last 20 years, unfortunately, unsuccessfully.
I know that we have a lot of questions, but I think that this one probably is a good one to end on, and that you had said you didn't want to go into politics, but what should the US do, or could the US do, must the US do to, as the leading nation in the world, the most advanced economically nation in the world, what can it do to create a positive peace, not only within the United States, but abroad?
Yeah, well, you save the most difficult question to the last, Lewis. And once again, I'm, in many ways, I'm unqualified to answer, as you'll have noted by the accent. I'm not even American myself, and I'd much prefer these questions to be explored by people with a deep understanding of the country. But a couple of notes about the United States. The United States does by no means well on the Global Peace Index, right? When we look at the absence of violence or fear of violence, the United States actually ranks 122nd from 163 countries. That actually puts it in line with other countries like, Guatemala, that may have very high levels of violence, but, are a lot less militaristic, or a lot less violent in other ways. I mean, it has one of the highest incarceration rates in the world. In fact, the highest incarceration in the world, very high levels of homicides, very strong, obviously nuclear weapons capability, militaristic militaristic means and expenditures that are symptomatic or representative of this underlying violence or fear of violence. So I think a certain amount of introspection is key, and I think that we're all having that at this point right now, in terms of how well do we serve as a leading example. I should say that the United States does do significantly better in the positive peace index, in measures of positive peace. So it has been deteriorating for the last 10 or 12 years. I have to say that. And I think that is one of the reasons why we have seen a lot of the increases in violence and civil unrest over the last couple of years. But I'd also posit this. The events in January 6th, for example, right? In many other nations with lower levels of positive peace, that would have represented a fall of government that would have degenerated into potential war on the streets, and basically a complete breakdown of both the economy and the institutions, and resulting in high levels of violence. Due to its high levels of positive peace, the United States was able to hold its stuff together. We were able to return to a relatively normal form of government within a 24-hour period. I mean, that's largely unheard of, and it's thanks to those high levels of positive peace. So I would say that, despite all of the challenges that we have, and despite all of the areas that we know that we need to work on, there are many, many areas in which the United States does very, very well in, and should continue to lead by example.
Well, great. I want to thank you, Michael, for taking the time to share with us all of this wonderful, insightful information. And I also want to encourage everyone who has been part of the audience to please come back on October 6th, when we'll hear from Murray Rose Williams with the Kansas City Star about the media's role in creating a positive peace. And then on October 27th, when we will hear from the Reverend Donna Simon on how a living wage can also work toward creating a positive peace. Everyone who's devoted energy and attention to this particular lecture, thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful day.